Okay, let's go. As we continue on looking at the years after the War of 1812, we should know that another change, another thing that's happening in those years after the war was that political parties are beginning to change. We'll get into that as we discuss in this lecture. And we also are going to see an expansion of suffrage. That is, more and more men are going to be able to have the right to vote. Now, this is a big deal because you may remember that at the time of the founding, the only people who could vote were adult white property-owning men. And this tended to then mean that the wealthier people in society, the wealthier men in society, were the only ones who could vote. But what we're starting to see in this first quarter of the 1800s is that states are going to begin to eliminate those property ownership requirements and allow what they call universal white manhood suffrage, which means that all white men 21 years of age or older will automatically have the right to vote. No more requirements to own property, no more requirements to pay taxes. If you are a white man and you're 21 years of age or older, you have the right to vote. Now, this is simply going to expand the electorate, right? We're going to have more and more people now able to vote. It's not what it needs to be yet, of course. Women do not have the right to vote. African Americans do not have the vote. Not even free blacks living in northern states had the right to vote. But it's a step in the direction of creating more of a real democracy, one where all citizens will eventually have that right to vote. But with this expansion of the voter base here, the expansion of the numbers of people who can vote, we're going to see that a new kind of politician can begin to win elections. Successful politicians, now that more and more people can vote, people who are less educated, people who may be factory workers and so on, successful politicians are going to have to be able to appeal to these masses of people, not just to the wealthy elite as they had before. And so the old kind of politicians like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, wealthy and highly educated, are going to have a harder time winning the votes of the masses of white men. And so we see a new kind of politician now beginning to emerge, a new kind of politician that can begin to win elections, and that's politicians like Andrew Jackson. I mean, Andrew Jackson was a wealthy man, but he'd been born in the territory of Tennessee. He'd been a frontiersman. He had earned his wealth, not inherited his wealth. He had become successful through hard work and determination. He was considered to be a man of the people. I mean, he was a hero of the people. Remember, he's the general. He's the leader of the troops at the Battle of New Orleans, and he's the kind of politician now that can now start to win elections. Andrew Jackson had very little formal education. He had what we might consider today to be about a 5th grade education. And you got to know that he can appeal to the less educated voters who are now having that chance to have their voice heard, all white men over the age of 21. So when we look at the rise of Andrew Jackson and his eventual presidency, we are also going to see the changing face of political parties in America in the early 1800s. So we're going to start with the election of 1824. The election of 1824 involved 4 major candidates for the office of president, and oddly enough, they all called themselves Republican. What we should note is that the Federalist Party had pretty much faded away after the War of 1812. They simply were not able to attract new members to the party. They simply could not put up a viable candidate anymore for the presidency. So we really just have, for this period of time, one one political party, and it's the Republican Party. However, what we see in this election of 24 is that between these four Republicans, you did have a lot of differences of opinions. And what we're going to see is that two parties now will eventually emerge from these Republicans here by the next election of 1828. Now, in 1824, as I said, you have four major candidates for the presidency. We have William A. Crawford. Now, William A. Crawford had been James Monroe's Secretary of the Treasury. Monroe was the outgoing president here. So he had government experience. But when it came to the issues that the Americans were becoming concerned about, things like the American system of protective tariffs and the government funding of internal improvements, Crawford opposed both. He opposed both of the parts of that American system. A second Republican candidate, John Quincy Adams. Again, son of the second president, John Adams. John Quincy Adams had been Monroe's Secretary of State. As we noted, he's the primary author of the Monroe Doctrine. And in those days, being Secretary of State was kind of a stepping stone to the presidency. No man had become president since Thomas Jefferson, who had not first served as Secretary of State. So it looked like John Quincy Adams may have had a real advantage going into this election. Now, when it came to the issues of protective tariffs and internal improvements, Adams favored the idea that the government should fund the internal improvements, but he wasn't really sold on the idea of a protective tariff. The third Republican candidate is Henry Clay. You remember Henry Clay was the author of the American system. He's the guy who proposed it to Congress in the first place. And so Henry Clay, of course, is running for the presidency completely and totally supporting the American system. Again, he supports the ideas of protective tariffs and government funding of internal improvements. Of course he would. And fourth is Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson, after the War of 1812, had gone into politics. And at the time of the election of 1824, he was a senator from Tennessee. But when it came to the issues surrounding the American system, Jackson tried to avoid committing himself to a position on these issues. He's not going to tell us if he favors internal improvements or favors protective tariffs, because he's hoping that he can win the presidency simply by capitalizing on his popularity as the hero of New Orleans. Right? So as this election plays out now, when the votes are counted, we're going to see that Jackson is going to lead the popular vote total. When the votes are all counted, Andrew Jackson has won 154,000 votes for the presidency. Now, again, we're talking about a much smaller country, a much smaller number of Americans who can vote. So even though 154,000 votes doesn't sound like much, he is the leader in the popular vote count. Adams came in second with 109,000 popular votes, and Crawford and Clay essentially tied. They each got around 47,000 or so. The electoral vote, of course, is what matters, right? It doesn't matter who wins the popular vote, it's who wins the electoral vote, the Electoral College. And so the Electoral College shows us, when this election was over, that Jackson had 99 electoral votes, Adams had 84, Crawford got 41, and Clay got 37. But here's the kicker. Nobody had enough to win. You have to have 133 electoral votes at this time to win the election, and nobody's got that. Again, Andrew Jackson has 99, Adams has 84, Crawford 41, Clay 37, but nobody had the 133 that they needed to win. Now, if there is not a clear winner in the Electoral College, the Constitution says that the election now goes to the House of Representatives. The House of Representatives, one state, one vote, will decide the outcome of this election. And so we have to assume that the states that had voted, the states that had gone for Jackson will vote for Jackson, right? The states that had gone for Crawford will go for Crawford, and so on and so forth. But it's fascinating as to what happens when the House meets to decide this election. First of all, Crawford had had a stroke. Crawford has taken himself out of the running. And so in the states that Crawford had won, whichever candidate had come in second in those states would be getting the votes that Crawford would have gotten. And Henry Clay decided to throw all of his support to John Quincy Adams. In other words, he tells the states that had voted for him in the election, I want you to vote for Adams instead. And with that support from Clay, then, Adams is going to have enough votes in the House of Representatives to become the president. Now, we got to know Andrew Jackson is mad about this. He believes he's been cheated, right? He had won the popular vote. He had the most electoral votes. He ought to become president, he thinks. And to make it worse, at least as Jackson looks at it, the first thing that John Quincy Adams did when he became president was to appoint Henry Clay Secretary of State, stepping stone to the presidency, right? Now, Andrew Jackson accuses Adams of making what he called a corrupt bargain, that the only reason he had appointed Clay to be Secretary of State was in return for Clay's support in winning the election. A corrupt bargain, he says, has been made between these two. Now, there's nothing wrong with that kind of a political agreement, right? Politicians do things like that all the time in return for support. But honestly, it doesn't matter if Andrew Jackson is mad. It doesn't matter if there had been a corrupt bargain, as he charged. The election was legitimate. John Quincy Adams will become president. But Andrew Jackson began campaigning immediately for the next election. I'll be back, Jackson says. You haven't heard the last from me yet. I don't think I wanted to go here quite yet, but we're going to just pause for a moment. All right. John Quincy Adams was one of the most intelligent men ever to become president, but he did not relate too well to the people. He, in many ways, was an old kind of politician. John Quincy Adams refused to play the political games that you had to play in order to do this new kind of politics after the War of 1812. Adams, like the presidents before him, had believed that once he became president, he was supposed to kind of rise above politics and become much more partisan. It may not be surprising to know that John Quincy Adams is a one-term president, but there's one issue that we want to look at from his presidency. That's another one of the issues that points to the growing sectionalism in the country. So in 1828, the last year of John Quincy Adams's presidency, a new protective tariff was passed in Congress. Now, remember, Southerners are hardest hit by what they called the tariff of abominations. Because remember, Southerners buy a lot of products from Europe, and a high protective tariff just means higher prices on the products that they buy from overseas. And Southerners also feared that Europe, especially Britain, would slap a high tariff on American cotton and thus hurt the Southern cotton industry. So the South protests the tariff of abominations, and South Carolina, the state of South Carolina, took the lead in these protests. South Carolina legislature published a pamphlet that they called the South Carolina Exposition, again, specifically to protest the tariff of abominations. The author was John C. Calhoun here. And yeah, he's got the craziest eyes I've ever seen on a picture of any political person in the past, but we just have to go with it. Now, the South Carolina Exposition was really based on the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions that had protested the Alien and Sedition Acts back in 1798. John C. Calhoun in South Carolina Exposition argued once again that they thought that a state should have the right to determine the constitutionality of a federal law and nullify that law within their state if they believe it to be unconstitutional, as they believed this tariff to be. But then Calhoun took the argument one step further. Not only did the South Carolina Exposition argue for the state's authority to nullify federal law, but they also argued that a state should be able to secede from the Union, should it so desire. That not only should a state be able to nullify a federal law, they ought to be able to leave the Union if they wish to do so. They ought to be able to secede from the Union of the United States. Now, no other state is going to join South Carolina in this protest, but once again, that doctrine of nullification is out there again, and we're going to hear a lot more about it as we move toward the Civil War. And now there's something new out there, the idea of secession. Should a state be able to leave the Union after it's joined? Is the union of the states permanent? Can states come and go? So a new idea is out there floating around as we begin now to move toward the years headed to the Civil War. Well, in the middle of all the protest over the tariff of abominations, however, there will be a presidential election in 1828. It's John Quincy Adams running for a second term, and Andrew Jackson, who swore he'd be back to run again, and here he is. They're both still Republicans, but this time around, they've added a couple of new labels on their parties, in a sense, in order to kind of differentiate these two branches of the Republican Party from one another. So John Quincy Adams is running for the presidency as a national Republican, and Andrew Jackson is calling his part of the party the Democratic Republicans. Adams' branch of the party is the National Republicans. Jackson's branch of the party is the Democratic Republicans. Now, this election is extremely nasty and personal. The campaigning will be extremely harsh on both sides, trying to demonize, trying to accuse the other of all kinds of political sins. If you want to know more about that election, I urge you to do some research. But ultimately, Andrew Jackson is going to win this election pretty easily. The electoral vote is going to be 178 for Jackson and only 83 for John Quincy Adams. And during and after Jackson's presidency, we're going to see now these two Republican parties, the National Republicans and the Democratic Republicans, morphing into two very distinct political parties. The National Republicans, Adams's branch of the party, will become the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. And Jackson's branch of the party, the Democratic Republicans, they're going to become the Democratic Party. And this is today's Democratic Party. So briefly, let's look at what these parties stand for, and I do mean briefly. The Democratic Party favors small, limited government. They really are still of the, they believe that the states ought to have more power than the federal government. They believe that the states should, the federal government should simply try to create some kind of equal opportunities for all Americans. But they really do not want a very powerful federal government. And in general, the Democratic Party will also support slavery. Slavery in the South and eventually slavery in the territories. The Whig Party, the National Republicans become the Whig Party, W-H-I-G. The Whigs support a much more activist and stronger federal government. For example, the Whigs favor the idea of Clay's American system. They think that a protective tariff is a good thing to encourage American manufacturing, and that the government should absolutely fund those internal improvements. The government should be paying for the creation of the canals and the railroads and the roads. And the Whigs are also tended more and more to be abolitionists, to support the idea that slavery should be abolished. But essentially now at this point we have two new political parties. We've gone from the Federalists and the Republicans back at the beginning to now a second system, a second political party system, the Whigs and the Democrats. But as I said, Andrew Jackson wins the election of 1828, and thus the Democratic Party, in a sense, is born. Historians consider Andrew Jackson's presidency to be the most significant presidency from the time of Jefferson until the time of Lincoln. In a sense, if you look at the presidencies from Jefferson all the way up until Lincoln, they say that Jackson is the most significant. And they say this not because of any great accomplishments on Jackson's part, but because of the fact that Jackson's use of presidential power will increase the power of the executive branch of government, will increase the power of the presidency. He changes the presidency in ways that will give the executive, the president, more power. And this is interesting because at the beginning, we noted that when the Constitution was written, it's pretty clear that the framers of the Constitution considered the legislature, the Congress, to be the most important branch of government, and thus they gave a lot more power to Congress than they gave to the president. But we should also note that that Jackson very much believes that the executive office should be much more powerful than Congress, or just as powerful as Congress, if not more. Jackson argued that individual congressmen and senators only represented a portion of the American people, that only the president represented the entire nation. Only the president can speak for the nation. And so surely the president was just as powerful as Congress, if not more. And with Jackson as president, it will be. So let's see how he uses his power. First, Jackson increases his power by exercising the presidential veto more than any other president had. Now, before Jackson, and Jackson was the 7th president, before Jackson, presidents had vetoed a bill only if they thought they were just flat, blatantly unconstitutional. And the first 6 presidents before Jackson together had used their veto power a total of only 9 times in the 36 years from George Washington in 1789 through John Quincy Adams in 1825. Jackson, however, Jackson is going to use the veto power not just against bills he thinks are unconstitutional, but against bills he just flat doesn't like. Bills that he thought were just bad bills that he didn't agree with. Where the first 6 presidents had vetoed 9 bills in 36 years, Andrew Jackson, all by himself, in the 8 years of his presidency, will veto 12 bills. He will use his veto power 12 times in 8 years, much more often than his predecessors had. Now, this does give Jackson power over Congress, right? Because Congress will probably start writing bills that Jackson will like. Yeah? And if they're going to avoid a veto, if they're going to get anything at all through without Jackson's veto, they might start crafting bills that he believes in. So this does, in fact, give the threat of that veto does give Jackson some power to influence the kind of bills that are coming out of Congress. Another way that Jackson increases power is to introduce to American government the spoils system. Jackson establishes the practice of giving important government jobs to those who support him. Again, this is known as the spoils system. And Jackson argued, you know, a president needs people that he trusts in certain federal jobs. And he's going to make sure that he appoints people to key positions, and we're not talking about the cabinet here, but to key positions in other parts of the government that supports his agenda, that supports his policy. He needs people he trusts in government jobs in order to carry out his policies. In other words, Jackson is going to take care of those who have supported him and helped him to become president. Now, excuse me. This may sound a little hypocritical when you remember how mad he had gotten over the so-called corrupt bargain between Clay and Adams, right? He had said that wasn't fair, but in a sense, he's doing the exact same thing by putting people that have supported him into various offices in the government. And a third way that Jackson changes the executive branch is by simply being a more partisan and politically minded president than had ever been seen before. Remember that George Washington had refused to even identify himself as a member of a political party. He opposed that ideas of political parties, and every president since him had believed that, again, that a president should rise above politics when he becomes president and no longer be so involved in the political machinations of a party. But not Jackson. Jackson takes sides. Jackson is going to be more partisan and more political than any other president had ever dared to be before. Jackson is going to be making decisions as president that he believed were good for the country, but also that he believed would be good for his political party, this new Democratic Party. He's doing his best to try to figure out how to get more Democrats elected to Congress, to offices in the future. Jackson takes sides politically, and so has every other president since. So we are very clearly seeing a lot of the aspects of our modern presidency developing during Jackson's term in office. But I do want to examine one of Jackson's policies a little more closely, and that is his policy toward Native Americans, his Indian policy, as they would have said at the time. Jackson's attitude toward Native Americans was pretty much the same as the attitude held by a lot of Americans at this point in time. They believed strongly that Native Americans would be better off if they were out of the way of the white man. That Native Americans in the East were somehow impeding the progress of the United States, that they needed to be removed. They needed to be moved away from the states themselves out into the territories. It was generally accepted that a permanent solution to the so-called Indian problem would be the removal and resettlement of Native Americans from the east to the Midwestern plains, specifically to what they called at that time the Great American Desert, the territories that are today Oklahoma, Kansas, because the native then would not be in the way of white growth and progress. And because everybody knew that land out there in the Great American Desert wasn't worth anything anyway, then the argument was, well, then whites would just leave the natives alone there. So, pack them up and move them out, put them out into Oklahoma, into Kansas, and thus whites would no longer bother them. They could live peacefully, separate. Now, let's understand that at this time there were 5 important tribes living in the southeastern part of the United States. We're talking about the southern states, Florida, Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee. 5 important tribes living in the southeast, and they are commonly known as the 5 civilized tribes. The tribes here are the Cherokee, the Creek, the Choctaw, the Chickasaw, and the Seminole. Now, they're referred to as civilized because these tribes, more than probably any others, had tried very hard to work with the whites. They had abandoned their traditional ways of living, and they had tried to live as whites did. They tried to assimilate into American society, and the Cherokees were one of the best examples of this. The Cherokees, for example, had opened schools for their children, just as whites had done. There was a written Cherokee alphabet. Most native languages were oral, but the Cherokees had developed an alphabet so that they could publish. They could print their own newspapers and books in the Cherokee language, just as the whites had done. The Cherokees had a written constitution for the tribe that had an executive, legislative, and judicial branch of government, just like the American whites had done. And some of the Cherokees even owned cotton plantations and slaves. Again, they had tried to be as whites were. They had tried to fit in, to assimilate into white society. But as much as these 5 civilized tribes had tried to be like whites, whites still considered them inferior. They still considered that they were in the way of white growth, the growth of white America, and they want them removed. So Andrew Jackson will push through Congress in 1830 a bill called the Indian Removal Act. Indian Removal Act in 1830 that will give the federal government the authority to try to negotiate with the tribes for voluntary resettlement, but will eventually lead to forced removal. During Jackson's presidency then and on into the next presidencies, the federal government tried to negotiate treaties with tribes offering the natives land in the Indian territories of the Great American Desert in return for their land in the east. Now, most northern tribes were small. They really didn't have a lot of effective way to resist, and most of the northern tribes voluntarily moved west. But in the south, it was a very different story. The 5 civilized tribes resisted. And once again, it's the Cherokee story that in many ways is our best example. The Cherokees tried legal means to resist removal. And in a case, a Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia, here, I'm trying to highlight here and not doing a great job of it. In a Supreme Court case called Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court upheld the Cherokees' rights to stay where they were and not be moved. In Worcester versus Georgia, the Supreme Court said that the Cherokee were an independent nation within the United States, and that the federal government had no right to force them to do anything, much less move into the Western territories. But let's understand that Jackson wants to open Indian lands to white settlement. Andrew Jackson ignored the Supreme Court decision in Worcester versus Georgia. Remember how much power he thinks he's got? He thinks he's more powerful than Congress. He clearly thinks he's more powerful than the Supreme Court. He ignored that Supreme Court decision in Worcester versus Georgia, and he ordered that Indian removal be carried out. The Army began then to gather the various tribes together who would not voluntarily move to force them to march to Indian Territory. The Cherokees called their march the Trail of Tears. 15,000 Cherokees were forced to walk west from northern Georgia, Tennessee, to Oklahoma. 116-day march in the dead of winter. Of that 15,000 Cherokees, 4,000 died on the way. All in all, 100,000 natives were driven out of the southeast states between 1820 and 1848. Of that 100,000, approximately 25,000 to 30,000 died in the process. Now, the Americans had promised the natives that they would be left alone in the new Indian Territory. They promised that the white man would never take away this new land. But we need to note that within 20 years of removal, white Americans began moving west into Indian Territory. And once again, we see an extremely shameful chapter in American history. This is John Rolfe. He was the chief of the Cherokee tribe. He is the author of the documents you read for your journal. John Ross wrote the Appeal of the Cherokee Nation, published it in newspapers, hoping that the American people would protest what their government was doing, would protest the removal of the Cherokee and other tribes, that they perhaps could put pressure on their government to reverse their course. But nobody seemed to care. I look forward to reading your journals as you explore the document and see what the Cherokees' argument was for staying in place, for staying where they were. And this last slide will show you just some of the routes that were taken by various tribes, the 5 civilized tribes, as they were marched in from their lands in the southeast into Indian Territory in the west. All right, this will complete our the information for our second exam. On Monday, I will announce the dates of that exam. I'm going to give you several days to access it. And if you have any questions, get with me. But again, watch for the announcement on Monday of the official dates of the online multiple choice exam that will serve as our second exam. I'm looking out my window and it's raining today. We just get through this one day at a time, folks. Thanks a lot.